Welcome back to our deep dive. If you're joining us for the Sino-Indian War 1962 revision series, we are officially on Module 5 today.
Right. Module 5 out of 6. We are getting into the real granular stuff now.
Exactly. So just as a quick recap for you, Module 4 covered all those high-level political factors, the higher direction of war and operational art. But today, we're dropping right down into the tactical reality.
Yeah, we're leaving the diplomatic meeting rooms and heading straight onto the ice. We're looking at the actual military factors that decided combat effectiveness on the ground.
Right. And our core theme for this session, which you really need to keep in mind, is that modern warfare is won before contact, through preparation, logistics, intelligence, and integration.
That's the golden rule here. So treat this deep dive as a professional military instructor revision lecture. Our mission today is high retention. We want you walking away with factual, analytical points covering doctrine, tactics, air power, logistics, and psychological warfare.
And we'll be pulling actionable lessons from all of this for future conflicts. So let's just jump right into Section 1, which is all about the doctrine and tactics adopted, specifically looking at Chapter 19 of our source material.
This is a high priority area for anyone studying this conflict. Because, like we said, wars are won before contact. And to understand that, we really have to examine how the Chinese evaluated the battlefield before a single shot was fired.
Yeah, their preparation was just, well, it was ruthless. I was reading about their intelligence gathering, this whole spy warfare system.
Oh, it was incredibly sophisticated.
Oh,
You picture 1962 Himalayas, you
yeah.
think maybe guys with binoculars on a freezing ridge.
Right, like very basic recon.
Exactly. But it was so much more than that. The Chinese utilized a very calculated ecosystem of extreme punishments and massive rewards for their intelligence operatives.
I mean, they were analyzing the physical and even the psychological state of the Indian troops constantly. And the way they handled converted spies is wild.
Yeah, captured personnel or flip locals. If they cooperated, they were actually treated remarkably well. They'd use them to literally call out to their former comrades, using that pre-existing trust.
Wow.
But for their own spies, failure was not an option. If you leaked info or failed a recon mission, the punishment was draconian. It ensured absolute compliance.
So they have this perfect picture of the Indian forces, but they didn't just stop at gathering intel. The sources talk a lot about their concealment tactics, which was a mix of passive and proactive concealment.
Right, passive concealment is just good operational security. Hiding commander identities, keeping schedules totally secret. The Indian intelligence was essentially operating blind.
But the proactive part, that's where they actively started messing with the Indian commanders, right?
Precisely. They would intentionally leak false information. They would actually abandon valuable provisions in plain sight to make an area look vulnerable.
Which is such a crazy risk. I mean, abandoning supplies in a mountain war where every calorie matters.
It's only a risk if you don't know your enemy. But the Chinese knew that the Indian political directive, the forward policy, demanded that troops push forward. So they dangled bait to pull Indian forces out of secure positions like Longpu and Chushul.
Which perfectly sets up their tactical formation. And the terminology here is just, I mean, it's fascinating. The Chinese called it hard head, soft tail, alarming back, and relaxed stomach.
It's very descriptive, almost biological.
Totally biological. When I read that, I immediately thought of an anglerfish. You know, that deep-sea fish that buries itself in the dark and dangles a little glowing lure?
That is actually a perfect analogy. Let's break down the mechanics of that anglerfish trap. The hardhead is the vanguard. You put your absolute best, most heavily armed forces right at the front for the initial shock.
Right, maximum impact.
Then the soft tail means keeping your exhausted troops, the ones dealing with altitude sickness, at the very rear, out of the fight so they don't drag down the momentum.
Smart. Keep the weak links out. And the alarming back.
That's your sober reserve, kept alongside the main thrust, completely alert, ready to instantly counter any flanking maneuvers.
And then comes the anglerfish lure, the relaxed stomach.
Right. They place small, seemingly vulnerable units down low, deep in narrow valleys. They knew Indian troops preferred to camp on the slopes and attack from above.
So they literally contoured their trap to Indian tactical habits.
Exactly. And once the Indian forces moved down to engage that relaxed stomach, the hard head and alarming back would snap shut from above and behind.
Slicing them into isolated pockets. I mean, the sources say the Chinese maintained a 3-to-1 or even 4-to-1 local superiority at these contact points.
Defeat in detail. It didn't matter what India's overall troop numbers were if they were outnumbered 4-1 in the actual gorge where the fighting happened.
Right. So looking at the Indian approach in contrast, it's just tragic. They were relying so heavily on static deployment.
The infamous penny packets, taking a cohesive brigade and scattering it across dozens of tiny isolated forward posts without any adequate depth or reserves.
And the intelligence failures behind this are just staggering. The Intelligence Bureau, the IB, based their entire military plan on the assumption that China wouldn't use force.
Wishful thinking, overriding capability-based assessment. And if we connect this to the standard principles of war for your exam framework, the contrast is stark.
Let's run through those principles.
Sure, China had clear selection and maintenance of aim and incredible concentration of force. They utilized absolute surprise and flexibility. India, meanwhile, failed fundamentally in security.
Right, because they were broadcasting troop movements in the media.
Exactly. You can't have surprise when your plans are in the morning paper. And India totally lacked a concentrated aim.
Okay, so that paints a really grim picture of the ground reality, but this brings us to Section 2, Chapter 20, which is a very high priority topic, the air aspects, or really the missing force multiplier.
Yes, the great what if of 1962.
Because if the ground troops are trapped and outnumbered in these valleys, why on earth didn't India use its air force? I mean, they had a massive technological advantage there.
They did.
Mm.
But the Indian Air Force, the IAF, was strictly limited to air supply drops. The use of offensive air power, things like close air support or interdiction, was explicitly denied.
And the ground commanders were begging for it, right?
Absolutely. Lieutenant General B.M. Call sent urgent requests for fighter support, but Army HQ and the cabinet flat out denied it. They ordered that the border must not be crossed.
Which is just, I mean, why the Chinese are overrunning your troops? Why keep your best weapon grounded?
It all comes back to a catastrophic intelligence failure by the director of the Intelligence Bureau, B.N. Mullick. He gave the cabinet these wildly inaccurate assessments.
Right, the 4,000 aircraft mix.
Exactly. He claimed China could field 4,000 aircraft, that they had MiG-21s, and most terrifyingly, that they had advanced night fighter and bomber capabilities.
He practically convinced the government that Chinese bombers were going to level Indian cities.
Right. But post-war intelligence proved that was complete fiction. China had 0 combat aircraft deployed in Tibet in 1962. 0. They didn't have MiG-21s there, and those night-capable MiG-19Ps didn't arrive until years later.
And what's really crazy to me is that the IB completely ignored the geography. They ignored the high-altitude aeronautics.
The payload penalties, yes.
Yeah.
Taking off from Tibetan airfields at 12 or 14,000 feet, the air is so thin that a bomber can only carry a fraction of its normal fuel and bomb load. A strategic bombing campaign against Indian cities from Tibet was physically impossible.
The math just didn't work. But India actually did have the capability that Mullick was so afraid of, didn't they?
That's the irony. India had 2 operational squadrons of Vampire night fighters. Plus, they had modern subsonic interceptors like the Hawker Hunters and Fallen Gnats.
So they were technologically superior, but paralyzed by fear. And there was a big foreign policy angle here, too, wasn't there?
Massive. The U.S. Ambassador, John Kenneth Galbraith, heavily influenced the Indian leadership not to escalate.
Because the U.S. was worried about a two-front war.
Exactly. They feared if India used the IAF against China, Pakistan might take advantage and attack on the western border.
Which leads to that incredible irony. PM Nehru was actually drafting a request to U.S. President Kennedy for 12 squadrons of American manned F-104s to protect Indian cities, while his own Air Force was just sitting on the tarmac.
It's one of the great tragedies of the war.
So wait, let me ask you this. If the IAF had been unleashed, if they had provided close air support and interdicted those Chinese supply lines, could it have completely changed the outcome in Ladakh and Nefa?
Without a doubt. With virtually no PLA Air Force presence, the IAF would have had absolute uncontested air superiority. They would have had a free run in the tactical battle area.
They could have been the alarming back the Army didn't have.
Exactly. They could have shattered the Chinese logistics train, bombed the mountain passes, and decimated those concentrated Chinese forces in the narrow valleys. It would have fundamentally altered the war.
Okay, so if you are taking notes, here is your ready answer framework for the exam. The critical analysis of the non-use of the IAF is driven by 4 things: political fear of escalation, flawed IB assessments of Chinese air strength, total ignorance of high-altitude aeronautics, and foreign diplomatic pressure.
That is a perfect summary. Memorize that.
All right, let's move to Section 3, Chapter 21, Operational logistics, because if you ground your Air Force, then survival rests entirely on your supply chain.
And here we have our memory trigger for the listener. Amateurs discuss tactics, professionals study logistics. In the Himalayas, the terrain is as lethal as the enemy.
It's a logistical nightmare. I mean, the deficits the Indian Army faced were just mind-boggling.
Staggering deficits. We're talking a shortage of 60,000 rifles, a lack of 10,000 trucks, missing field cables for basic communication.
And the weapons themselves, the Indian troops were relying on World War I era .303 Lee-Enfield bolt-action rifles.
Right, going up against Chinese forces equipped with modern automatic weapons, machine guns, and heavy mortars. The firepower asymmetry was brutal.
And because they didn't have roads, they had to rely on airdrops. But the sources say 30 to 40% of those airdrops just completely failed.
Because of cost-saving measures, bureaucrats in New Delhi decided to recycle old, weather-beaten parachutes to save money.
So they drop the supplies, the troops have to gather these wet, freezing parachutes, ship them all the way back down the mountain on mules, patch them up, and use them again.
And as a result, a third of the drops hit the mountains at terminal velocity and shattered. You lose millions of rupees in destroyed equipment just to save pennies on campus.
And it gets worse. The kerosene drops. They needed kerosene for heating and melting snow, but instead of small jerry cans, what did they drop?
Massive 44-gallon steel drums.
Just bouncing down a Himalayan cliff. How is an exhausted, freezing soldier supposed to haul a massive steel drum up a sheer incline at 14,000 feet?
They couldn't. It was completely inaccessible. It shows a total disconnect between the logistical planners and the physical reality of the front lines.
The only option left was human transport. Porters. And the math here is just devastating.
It is. A porter has a 4 to 5 day turnaround in bitter cold. So he has to carry his own survival gear, his own rations, his own blankets.
Which eats into his payload.
Exactly. By the time he accounts for his own survival, the effective payload of supplies he's actually delivering to the troops drops to a meager 5 kilograms.
5 kilos? That's a few magazines of ammo and maybe some biscuits.
It's a system consuming itself just to function. And this reality is captured perfectly in the call report. On October 7th, LT Gen Call sent a dispatch from Dola.
Yeah, that report is chilling.
He noted that frontline troops had exactly 3 days of rations left. They had 50 rounds of ammunition per man.
50 rounds, that's minutes of fighting.
And they were trying to sleep to 15,000 feet in summer cotton uniforms with a single blanket.
It's a miracle they didn't all just freeze to death before the shooting started. And then you compare that to the Chinese logistical machine.
Which is built on years of strategic patience. China had built all-weather roads throughout Tibet.
Including lateral roads, right?
Yes, lateral roads running parallel to the McMahon Line. This is a massive tactical advantage. It allows you to rapidly shift motorized reserves from one sector to another, completely outmaneuvering the static Indian posts that had to march for weeks just to change positions.
So China had prepared logistics, road networks, massive stockpiling. India had recycled parachutes and 5-kilo payloads. It's barely even a fight at that level.
Right. Which brings us to Section 4, Chapter 22, Psychological Warfare and the Human Element. Because logistics dictates your physical ability to survive, but psychological warfare targets your will to fight.
And the Chinese were actively trying to break the minds of these freezing, starving soldiers.
Absolutely. The Chinese psyops were highly targeted. They set up forward loudspeakers, sometimes just a few hundred yards from the Indian trenches.
And they weren't just playing noise, they were broadcasting in the native languages of the specific Indian troops deployed there, Hindi, Punjabi, Gorkhali.
Right. Imagine being an isolated Indian soldier. Your radio is dead. You have 50 bullets. You're in a summer shirt. And out of the freezing dark, a voice in your mother tongue is telling you that you've been abandoned by New Delhi, that defeat is inevitable, highlighting all your deprivations.
It's designed to create a sense of utter hopelessness and isolation, and it's so relevant today, right? If you look at modern information warfare, the technology has changed from loudspeakers to cyber campaigns and social media, but the goal is the same.
Exactly the same.
Yeah.
Create a perceived sense of discrimination or deprivation. Sever the trust between the soldier and the leadership.
But despite all of this, the human element on the Indian side is just incredible. The morale and fighting spirit against all odds.
The heroism is undeniable. And for the exam, you must remember the Battle of Razangla in the Chushul sector.
Ah, Major Shaitan Singh and the 13th Kuman Regiment?
Yes, Charlie Company.
Ah.
About 112 to 114 Indian defenders holding a ridge at over 16,000 feet. They had no artillery support. They were facing a massive Chinese assault backed by heavy bombardment.
And they didn't retreat.
They fought to the last man. Out of that company, 109 were killed in action. Only a handful survived, mostly severely wounded and taken prisoner. And nearby at Gurung Hill, a force of 17 men faced a similar onslaught and fought until every single one was killed.
They held the line with their lives. It's awe-inspiring. But, heroism alone doesn't win wars.
Which brings us to Section 5, Chapter 23. This is the most important section of the deep dive, the lessons learned.
Yes. Defeat is a harsh instructor. And this is where we distill these brutal realities into an exam-ready framework. Let's break it down into 4 categories: strategic, operational, tactical, and capability lessons.
Okay, let's start with strategic.
The number 1 strategic lesson was the shift to realistic threat assessment. India had to abandon the wishful thinking of the IB. You don't base plans on the assumption that an enemy won't attack. You base it on their physical capability to attack.
Right, and then there's civil-military coordination.
Crucial. The disaster proved that institutionalized national security management is necessary. Politicians cannot ignore professional military advice. And the ultimate example of that was the Thorat Plan, right?
Yes, Lieutenant General Thorat. Years before the war, he accurately predicted the Chinese threat and proposed a doctrine of defense in depth, rather than the exposed forward policy.
But Defense Minister Krishna Menon just arrogantly ignored it.
He buried it. Thorat's plan proved that military reality has to overrule political posturing.
Okay, moving to operational lessons.
This was the end of the penny packet deployment.
Yeah.
India learned they had to move away from static linear posts to terrain-based deployment.
Meaning you hold the tactically vital ground, not just an invisible line on a map?
Exactly. Defense in depth, with strong mobile reserves ready for aggressive counterattacks, joint operations integration became a priority.
What about tactical lessons?
First and foremost, mountain warfare training. You can't just throw unacclimatized troops from the plains into the Himalayas. This directly led to the creation of the High Altitude Warfare School, HEWS, in Gulmarg.
A total game changer for their readiness. And they learned some really harsh lessons about basic fieldcraft, didn't they?
Written in blood. Like the rule against lighting fires on patrol. There's a famous anecdote where an artillery officer insisted on lighting a fire to brew tea in the freezing cold, despite his JCO's warnings.
And the Chinese saw the smoke or the light and ambushed them.
Wiped them out. Discipline is survival. They also learned the absolute necessity of digging deep trenches with overhead cover to survive artillery and strict fire control.
Right, so you don't empty your 50 rounds into the dark when the Chinese send a probing attack.
Exactly. Save your ammo for the main assault. And finally, capability lessons.
Infrastructure and tech.
Yes. The glaring asymmetry in road networks had to be closed. And intelligence gathering had to upgrade from just relying on human sources to integrated tech like Techint and SIGINT. Satellite photos don't lie about enemy capabilities.
So all of these painful lessons lead us into Section 6, Chapters 24 and 25, the implications and modern relevance. Because learning a lesson is one thing, but actually implementing it is another. Did this defeat actually transform India?
It completely transformed the nation. The 1962 defeat shattered the Hindi-Chini Vaihai illusion. It killed the Nehruvian idealism. Defense budgets jumped immediately.
I mean, they nearly doubled overnight, from 474 to 816 crores.
Right, and India implemented its first 5-year defense plan in 1964. This rapidly modernized the army, expanded the military, raised specialized mountain divisions, and deeply integrated the Air Force.
But did it change their mindset? Because there was another clash just 5 years later in 1967 at Nathu-La.
Yes, and Nathu-La is the perfect proof that India applied the lessons of 1962. Chinese forces attacked Indian working parties with artillery, trying to test their resolve again.
But this time, India didn't wait for New Delhi to debate it.
No, the Indian artillery retaliated immediately and heavily. They devastated the Chinese positions, resulting in roughly 340 Chinese dead. It proved India's new defensive resolve and tactical readiness. They weren't going to be bullied anymore.
Which brings us to the modern line of actual control. The parallels between 1962 and the 2020 Galwan Valley standoff are just undeniable.
The political drivers are eerily similar. Mao Zedong used the 1962 war to distract from the catastrophic domestic failures of the Great Leap Forward. He needed a unifying external enemy.
And you look at Xi Jinping in 2020.
Right. Xi Jinping utilized the border escalation amidst the immense economic and domestic pressures of the COVID-19 pandemic and the internal push for the China dream. An external conflict rallies nationalism.
But the Indian response today is totally different.
Because of operational preparedness, India has shifted from positional defense to offensive defense. They are postured to rapidly counterattack.
And they can only do that because they finally closed that infrastructure gap.
Exactly. The rapid construction of the Darbuk-Shaikh DBO Road, which is a massive lateral lifeline, and the Adel Tunnel, providing all-weather connectivity. These are direct, physical answers to the logistical nightmares of 1962.
It's all about multi-domain operations and integrated warfare now. The lessons of 62 are quite literally paved into the mountains today.
They absolutely are.
All right, that brings us to our outro. It's time for the 5-minute rapid recall. We want you to lock this into your memory for the exam. Let's rapid fire the core concepts.
Okay, starting with Doctrine. Chinese infiltration and encirclement, the anglerfish trap, versus Indian static forward posts and penny packets.
Air power.
Grounded due to faulty IB intel from Moloch and political fear of escalation. Its absence was arguably the decisive factor.
Logistics.
The Indian nightmare of recycling parachutes and 5-kilogram porter payloads versus the Chinese advantage of Tibetan lateral road networks.
Psychological warfare.
Chinese loudspeakers exploiting isolation, countered by the incredible last-stand heroism of Indian troops at places like Rosangla.
And finally, the lessons.
A total shift to capabilities-based threat assessment, the creation of the high-altitude warfare school, and the modern offensive-defense strategy backed by massive infrastructure upgrades.
Perfect. Now for the top 15 exam keywords you absolutely must memorize. I'll read them off, you internalize them. Forward policy, hardhead softtail, B.N. Mulloch, the IB director, Vampire Night Fighters, Close Air Support, or CAS, General Staff Reserves, .303 Rifles, Rosangla, High Altitude Warfare School, HAWS, the Thorat Plan, Offensive Defense, Nathullah, 1967, the Darbuk-Shaikh DBO Road, Asymmetry in Infrastructure, and Information Warfare.
If you can deploy those terms accurately in your answers, you are in great shape.
So as you study this week, here are 5 likely questions you need to prepare for. 1. What were the strategic and tactical lessons learned from the 1962 war? 2. Critically analyze why air power was not used.
3. Evaluate the role of logistics in India's defeat. 4. Compare and contrast Chinese and Indian tactics.
And 5. What is the relevance of 1962 lessons in the modern LAC context? Ponder those. Try outlining answers for them using the frameworks we just discussed.
And remember, understanding the failure is the key to understanding the modern Indian military.
Absolutely. Well, that wraps up Module 5. The final module, Module 6, studies how 1962 completely reshaped India's defense thinking, examines the key personalities involved, and consolidates the entire war into exam-ready frameworks. You won't want to miss it. But until then, I want to leave you with one final provocative thought. We've talked so much about physical infrastructure today, the roads and tunnels. But with the rise of modern cyber and space domains, is pouring concrete in the Himalayas preparing for the next war, or is it just finally preparing for the last one? Something to chew on. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you in Module 6.